Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream. And today we're going to be having a discussion with Professor Lawrence Schiffman. And this involves a new book that came out recently, last month, The Dead Sea Scrolls, New Insights on Ancient Texts. It's good to have you back on the show, Larry Schiffman.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
It's good to have you back on.
Yep.
Can you tell us a little bit about what is different about this new edition of the book before I get to my questions?
When I say new edition of the book, it's a brand new book.
Yeah.
And
That's what I
the
meant.
book actually stems from a conference that we held some time ago at NYU. And we had a variety of scholars who presented what was new research. And that research was meant to sort of demonstrate, even beyond the actual studies in the volume, it was meant to demonstrate the progress that was going on in the field, which, of course, much of that progress is technical on issues that the average person isn't concerned with. But nonetheless, we were very happy to be able to host that conference and to bring those scholars together. And that's really the volume is, as far as I can see, I would say, one of those building blocks on which we are building the field, moving forward, but also an opportunity to show people that the field isn't static and that research has to go on, and that we have a lot of things which we're able to discover and which we're able to put forward to the public. And the other just nice thing about the program that we held, which became this volume, is that it was open to the public, and we had a large number of interested people coming in order to appreciate the program and to enjoy it. So that's just another thing in terms of getting it out to a wider public. One thing also is that a lot of Dead Sea Scrolls materials are published by very special publishing houses. And here we were happy to see it come out with Palgrave, which is a publishing house that does a lot of ancient stuff. And in the process of doing all these ancient things means that we're now listed with some classicists and some others that aren't really exactly in our field. And this gets us an opportunity to be known to a wider group, a sort of a different group than the ones we're usually working with. So from that point of view, we were happy to be able to see the volume come out and to get it out to the public. And hopefully people will be reading it, and it can be read by the general public. If I would say, if you're a sort of educated member of the general public, I wouldn't suggest trying to read a book like this if you don't know anything about the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's not your starting point. It's not your first book. There are other excellent books. I can advertise my own Reclaiming the Dead Sea Scrolls, but other excellent books. Van de Kam and Flint is another excellent book by James Van de Kam and Peter Flint. These are fine introductions. We have a fine recent book on the Qumran Library by Sidney Crawford. So there are a lot of these books. I'm advertising my friends' books, I admit it. But at any rate, the point is that we have a lot of fine introductions. And this is a research work which is moving the field forward, which is what we really want to do and what scholars are supposed to do. By the way, we might mention, I know people don't realize this, they wonder why professors don't teach a lot more. And it's true, we have lighter loads than, let's say, a high school teacher. But much of the reason for that is because of the fact that we're involved in being able to do research. And the research that we do is a very important part of our life, our career, and basically what we're there for. Now, also, one other thing I want to point out about this volume, which makes me very proud, is we brought together a group of excellent Israeli and American scholars. And I think we had a European scholar in as well. And this made us happy. And also the opportunity to demonstrate that our university is really a center for the study of the Dead Sea Scrolls, something that's been going on for years. So anyhow, that's a kind of long summary and explanation of why we're so proud of the volume.
Can you tell us about the process of the conservation and preservation of the scrolls?
Yeah, I think I could tell you quite a bit. There is a lab in Israel run by the Israel Antiquities Authority, which has a group of excellent professionals, originally some people who worked on papyri in what was then the Soviet Union, and then they came to Israel. They were very expert in this, and Israel makes use of quite a number of outside advisors, like the Getty Museum and other places like that. And basically, the initial effort was one of cleaning, because the stuff had been left in under the Jordanians in ways in which it was not quite up to par. But there was a different problem, which was that a lot of the fragments, the small fragments, had the problem. And I'm now talking about the fragmentary part of it. The larger scrolls are in the Israel Museum, and there the effort is somewhat easier, but there also is an ongoing conservation program. Now, what they do is, in these conservation programs, they photograph this material constantly to see whether it's deteriorating, and they are constantly cleaning and treating materials in order to improve the preservation of the material. And this is an ongoing process. Also, of course, as anyone would know, they have to have the right temperature and the right moisture and all that. So they take advice from all kinds of experts. The old way had been to store them in between plates of glass. And when Israel came in after the 1967 war, they were advised that this was no good. And over a period of time, the material was eventually transferred to being in rice paper folders. And that's the way it is mostly kept today. And this is an ongoing process. And there's an ongoing process also of cataloging in greater detail. It's also done in the same lab by the same people. And also, we should mention that the rephotographing, the Israel Antiquities Authority and the Israel Museum each have websites where you can see photographs of the scrolls. And in the Antiquities Authority, where they're rephotographing much of it that was only in black and white, they're photographing it now. Of course, when we say black and white, that includes infrared, which is very important, but it looks black and white to the outsider. But they're now making very specialized color photos, which use different kinds of processes and give us different looks, you might say, at the material. So it's a big process. There's one other thing which I should mention. When you go to a museum exhibit on the Dead Sea Scrolls, apparently we'll have them again starting in 225 in the U.S. And when you go to one of these museum exhibits, that's an opportunity where those fragments that are going to be exhibited are getting a special cleaning and a special conservation process. And that allows also, because of the funding of these exhibits, the money you pay when you go in, some of it's going to that process of enabling the Antiquities Authority in preparing those aspects that are going, those fragments that are going to be on exhibit, to, as I say, do a special job. And more fragments are running through that process as well and getting that special upgraded treatment of conservation, which is why we're, I think, pretty sure that we're going to have the stuff with us for as long as humanity.
Can you tell us about multispectral imaging and how that's helped?
Yeah, I'm not a great
scrolls?
expert on multispectral imaging from the point of view of the physics, but what's happening here is that photographs are taken in which different parts of the color spectrum are emphasized, and then these are remerged together. And when they are remerged together, you get a quality of photograph of a very difficult text to read that you could not have gotten. And these photos are extremely important. The new photos we're getting are better and better. But we do have to remember that in some of the scroll materials, they're so browned out, so to speak, it's so dark that it's really only the infrared that you can read it. And that brings out it's an old technique, not a new technique. And it brings out the quality in a way that you could not, it's like it sees through it. I'm working right now with a colleague on some little fragments with Andrew Gross from Catholic University of America. We together re-edited the Temple Scroll. We have now a small fragment that we're working on. Cassia Ramon, who is the curator at the Israel Museum Shrine of the Book, she's actually the person who handles the preservation of the materials and the conservation. She has been working on this fragment for some time and asked us to work on it in terms of trying to read it and place it in the scroll. In any case, you seem to have here an infrared can see right through it. You have two layers, one on top of the other. So when we look at it, we're seeing as if you had two sheets of paper, one on top of the other on your X-ray through it. So you're looking at two texts at once. You don't know which is which. You got to figure it out to be able to read it. Hopefully, we'll get it figured out before the year or so that we're working on it is over. But anyhow, so what the multispectral imaging does is it allows you to take all these different photos of different aspects of the color, then remerge it to get a photo.
I'm going to take a question from Matt Makes Cards. Thank you for your question. Can you speak on the use of conjectural emendation on translations of the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Let me first make sure that everybody knows that if you're reading a Dead Sea Scrolls translation, you see brackets, and those brackets indicate where a restoration has been made. Now, restorations can be made in a number of ways. Some restorations are based on alternative manuscripts. They're pretty definite. And so readers reading them don't have to worry whether it's really the text. They may also be a result of a biblical expression or something that's from the Hebrew scriptures that the editors realize belongs there. So they filled it in. Now, beyond that, there may be guesswork restorations. And guesswork restorations might be right, they might be wrong. There's no way to know. And hopefully an editor of the Dead Sea Scrolls that knows what he or she is doing will not put a guesswork type restoration into the translation if it's really that, if it's a guesswork. They would put it in a footnote or something like that, but they wouldn't confuse you by putting it in. And they would be asking themselves, could this be the real text? And sometimes it's pretty clear that it could be, and it's okay. Sometimes it's a conjecture. And if it's a conjecture and it's a popular version of the translation, you'd be better off without it. Now, I just want to say that I think there are less conjectures than people realize. And I think that has to be understood because there's been so much research on some of these texts that when you get a restoration, it's usually a pretty good one. There was a time when, for example, many of us didn't realize that you have to count the letter spaces. Sounds funny. It looks like it's obvious, right? You got to count the letter spaces to make sure the restoration fits. So we have some translations that have restorations that don't fit. There's not enough room in the broken piece for it. So those restorations are obviously no good. But I think people can be pretty sure that the overall meaning of the text they're reading is not being altered by these type of conjectures. I think there are a few places where I know I could say that it was altered, but generally most of the translations are okay.
Can you tell us about purity and purification in the Dead Sea Scrolls and Mikvat of Qumran, the convergence of text and archaeology? Your contribution.
Of course, this is my paper in the volume. I delivered this paper at the conference. We use that expression. Scholars just read versions of their research and then discuss it, but it's literally read. And the general audience wonders, why are we getting that and not getting a kind of off-the-cuff conversation? But that's what we do. So at any rate, right, that was my paper. And basically what I tried to do was to compare the fact that mikvaot, which means ritual baths, and the singular of that is mikveh, usually pronounced in American usage as a mikveh. And this is a ritual bath which is used to attain ritual purity. And what I did was I brought together the evidence for those of which there are 11 that have been identified at Qumran. I brought together that evidence with material pertaining to laws of purity and purification in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, people need to know that the Dead Sea Scrolls sectarians were very, very big on maintaining this ritual purity. Now, the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, have a lot of requirements regarding ritual purity, specifically talking about people who are going to the temple or who are the priests, the Hebrew Kohanim, we call them, whether they are the priests or going to the temple for their own worship purpose. And those people have to be pure, and the average person does not have to be ritually pure. Now, what we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls sectarians and some other sectarian groups of Jews in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, 1st century CE, is that they adopt those standards of purity and purification to be pure in daily life, even though those things have no obligation according to the Bible, and yet they're doing them in their daily life. So that's the case with the Dead Sea sectarians. So they have these ritual baths, and they're bathing regularly to maintain this ritual purity. And the important thing to do was to get at the texts that describe the types of impurity, the manner in which these ritual baths are made and operate, etc., and the significance of purity for the Dead Sea Scrolls sectarians in their lives. So that's basically what I did in this study. It basically brings archaeological evidence and textual evidence together that are generally being considered separately.
Can you tell us more about purity and impurity, and what were the kind of processes that they employed to remain pure daily?
Well, the first thing is, if you want to remain pure, depends. Let's talk about specific impurities. So one of the impurities is contact with the dead. That requires, according to the Torah, the sprinkling on the person during a 7-day period on days 3 and 7 of a water, a liquid, on which there has been placed the ashes of the red heifer. This is according to Numbers 19. So that's one type of impurity. Then you get impurity from bodily flows, like gonorrhea, or a woman's menstruation, or a blood flow not during menstruation. These require immersion in a ritual bath. Then you have an obligation again. Remember that a lot of this stuff is only everything we said so far. In fact, technically, according to the Bible, only applies if you go to the temple. But these sectarians did it anyhow. So anyhow, another example of that is, right, so they say gonorrhea, seminal emission. These would cause an impurity. And you also have these so-called dead creeping things, certain type of reptiles that if you come in contact, you become impure. And in all these cases, you purify through the ritual bath. So they had 11 of these ritual baths at Qumran. They're fed by natural water, that is to say, not from some kind of a water source that's been gathered together, that is to say, stored. It's water that flows directly, either well water or rainwater that flows in directly from some type of conduit. Those conduits can actually be seen in Qumran, and that allows the person to become pure. Now, to maintain purity, you simply have to stay away from what's impure. So if someone's pure on Monday, doesn't come in contact with any of those things, and it's now Wednesday, that person's still pure. But there are specific impurities that can happen in regular human life to regular human people. And when they are, these people would have purified themselves at all times.
And what do we know about their water supply?
Well, the interesting thing about the water supply is it comes once or twice a year. It rains once or twice a year. The extent of archaeological evidence of the water supply is tremendous. Up on the hills above Qumran, that is to say, to the west, you have water catchment areas that were built by the sectarians that then feed into tunnels that are lined with limestone. Excuse that, lined with limestone. And that is to say, some kind of plaster. Those are about the size that a person can crawl through. They lead down the hill, gather together, and run into an aqueduct. Now, most people think an aqueduct is this gigantic high thing like you can see in Caesarea, for example. But the aqueduct is really running along the ground, and it has stones on the sides and a bottom, and it's been cemented in with ancient cement so that it's waterproof. And the water runs through there and runs through a whole variety of facilities. So there are ritual baths that we mentioned, but there are cisterns where you keep your drinking water. And those are gigantic because it's going to rain once, maybe twice. And then the third place, type of water installations have to do with pottery. There are things for cleaning pottery, cleaning the clay. There are other type of water installations in the site of Qumran, which apparently were used by the sectarians and others for what we could call industrial purposes. But at any rate, most of the water ran in and was stored in cisterns. I can tell you that there was a theory by some that the people bathed, washed, drank all the same water. And I asked somebody, washed their clothes in it. I asked somebody in public health if that was possible. and he told me they might live for the first year, but by the second year they'd all be dead. So apparently these different water installations are used for different purposes. Again, for bodily cleansing, and that's the ritual baths, and also for functions which are industrial, and then for eating and washing clothes and all the things we use water for. And they had a lot more water than you would have thought, because it rains like crazy there in those 1 or 2 storms. They are massive.
Do guesswork reconstructions tend to happen very often, or are most of the text preserved quite well so that most of the time those kind of guessworks don't need to take place?
Yeah, it's not really a matter of preserve well. Well, let me put it this way, though. If you take your average Dead Sea Scrolls text, I'm not sure if this is really true, the average, but large numbers of them, the majority of the text is preserved, and therefore when I say the majority of the text, I got to go stick back for a second. The fragmentary materials that are in the Israel Antiquities Authority collection, so they usually represent only 5 to 15% of the manuscript, as we can assume. And therefore, when we say what I'm talking about is the actual fragment itself, many of the words are connected to the word before the word after, right? The breaking is around the edges usually. And so as a result of that, we have a pretty good idea from the middle of what the text is about. And that, of course, regulates these guesswork restorations. So you're not going to get restorations that are way off of the mark. So the other thing is that this field has now been around for 70 years, almost 75 years. And so guesswork restorations have been overturned. And so other restorations have been substituted, which makes sense as scholarship has proceeded. And therefore, I think that maybe the restoration is wrong, but a good scholar will not put in a restoration that can have a large impact on the meaning of the text if they don't know it's there. One can give the example of the mention of, like, for example, someone would restore the name of Jesus into one of the scrolls in some hole and say, this is a guesswork restoration. Of course, because the whole discussion of, the scrolls being pre-Christian, and this would cause who knows what kind of crazies to come out of the woodwork. But nobody would do that, because that's the type of restoration that would overturn the whole meaning of the text and turn it into something else. And scholars know better than to do that. So I think we got where we do have guesswork because of lack of choice. It's not really far off from what would have been there.
In the process of guesswork reconstructions, what do they base their speculations off of when they look at the surrounding text that they know is there?
Most people don't speculate. That's the point. Most restorations are based either parallel manuscript that's fragmentary but has the same text, biblical parallel, or the context. And the context is not totally speculative. And then people will not put in restorations if they have no idea what belongs there or what could belong there reasonably. So in general, there is a kind of standard to avoid really these kind of wild guessworks. And that's why I think that you can basically read the translations reliably. They're really saying what the text is about.
Has this purity practice always been a thing at Qumran? For as long as their community existed, or did it also experience changes over time?
The problem is like this: everything experiences changes over time. So that's kind of how should we say? There's no question about that. The problem is whether we can know what these changes are, given the fragmentary nature of the material we have and the ongoing debates over the chronological order of some of the texts, let alone the various manuscripts of some texts. So we can't really reconstruct chronological orders, but this is what we can say. The sectarians settled there in about 100 BCE. They were there until they were probably attacked and defeated by the Romans in 68 CE. We know that because we know that the Romans were in that area, according to Josephus and the archaeology matches. So let's say from 100 BCE to 68 CE, 168 years, So obviously things would have changed because nothing stays the same for such a long period of time. On the other hand, these ritual baths are part of the archaeology of the site the entire time. So one would assume that ritual purity is being practiced the entire length of time that the sectarians existed.
Was their purity laws consistent completely with the Torah, or did they embellish the laws? Were they more strict than what the
Oh, they're
Torah?
more strict, first of all, than the Torah, because the Torah commands you to observe these laws if you go into the temple. And they turn around and said, everybody's got to keep it all the time. So that is certainly a greater stringency. And then the other thing is, that's basically where it is. It's not, they do expand in the way they understand the law. They're on the strict side and they take the most strict view of the biblical law, but the very expansion from temple only to the whole life of the sectarian group is itself a big expansion of what the Torah said.
What about the righteous teacher? Do we know what how he viewed the purity laws and his
Well, we
practices
know
regarding
one
that?
thing. The righteous teacher, who was, for those in the audience who might not be so familiar, he was the leader of the sect at some point. Now, one gathers from the texts that he was not there when they immediately broke away from the mainstream in Jerusalem, but he came to the fore after a short period and led the sect until he passed away. Now, one assumes, and I have to admit to some extent this is an assumption, that what we know about this righteous teacher or teacher of righteousness, depending on where you want to translate it, is that he was a central leader in forming the sect and its way of life. If that's the case, then we can, again, this is an assumption, assume that he stood behind the purity laws and that was one of the influences in the group that decided to make this stringency of taking purity laws for priests and those going to the temple and impose them on your so-called average guy at Qumran. So that seems to be the case. Much more than that, we don't know.
So let me see if there's a question in the chat. Let me see here. Nothing relevant to the discussion right now. So can you tell us anything about the Cave One community and what do we know about them?
Well, first of all, they didn't live in the caves. So let me just specify that one may have lived in other caves, but not in the manuscript caves. So let me just explain that Cave One is a text called the Community Rule. And Cave One had the Community Rule. It also had a text that we call the Messianic Rule, or the rule of the congregation for the end of days, which told what life would be like in the end of days. And finally, Cave One had quite a number of Bible texts and very important texts. In fact, among the most complete texts that are now Cave One material, which was acquired by the Israel Museum, that's a sort of summary of what happened, right? Some was acquired by the government, some by the Hebrew University. But at any rate, it's sitting in the Israel Museum at the Shrine of the Book, if you go there to see the exhibit there, which everyone should go and see if you're interested in the scrolls. So at any rate, if you take a look at the rule of the community, the so-called Thanksgiving scroll, the War scroll, the Great Isaiah scroll, these are texts which really help to outline the whole nature of the group. And we find out about the forms of how you get in, that there is a kind of a procedure that you have to pass certain tests. We find out about the disciplinary system of the sect, basic beliefs, including some which are a little strange to most people who understand Judaism and Christianity, predestination, and also a dualistic view of the world, that people are already divided by the predestined to be good or bad. And these views, which are part of the sectarian ideology, already clear from material in Cave One. So that's a sort of a quick summary of why Cave One gives us tremendous information about the sect and about its way of life that we otherwise, I think, would have had more trouble figuring out. And Cave One was discovered first and became available first. And it provides, therefore, a kind of a framework of what we assume the sectarian setup would have been in general, and to a great extent, other texts, rightly or wrongly, are seen as supplementing these texts.
I want to go back to the beginning for a second. Can you tell us a little bit more about the new insights into the text? And my second part to that question is how new technology has assisted in Dead Sea Scroll research.
Well, so I'm going to say that one of the presentations that we had at our conference was by a group of people who are involved in the Israel Antiquities Authority's laboratories and work on the scrolls. And there you see a tremendous impact of the technology that you mentioned before, in terms of the types of photographs that can be made, the types of images that are available. And I think for most of us, that has been the biggest influence of technology. There are some other technological forms of research going on, and we also have various new websites that are coming into being. That is sort of technology of database management, which has been very good for us. And as a result, we do have these new programs. There is a thing called Qumran Digital that's coming out of Göttingen, a group of scholars there. And the Antiquities Authority is moving on with very technical cataloging. They also now have projects going for investigation of the ink and other physical aspects of the scrolls. These things are very important. We've had this fantastic program that opened up a burned scroll and was able to read the initial columns of a scroll that was completely burned in antiquity. It's probably a 4th century scroll or 5th century scroll. It was found in the Ark of the Synagogue that was excavated in Antiquity, which is also a site of the Dead Sea. And that type of work has been going on. So technology is beginning to help. But I do have to say that it's not as important as still the old-fashioned research that's going on. Now, the volume, right, had quite a number of articles written. For example, Jonathan Ben-Dov, who gave a paper on it's published here, The Scope and Purpose of Encrypted Writing at Qumran. He's been very, very much involved in the investigation of the writing methods and things having to do with the physical scrolls. And he and some colleagues at Tel Aviv University are doing wonderful work in this area. And they were able, in fact, to reconstruct a scroll where we weren't sure what the order of the fragments was. We didn't know the size of the fragments, et cetera, et cetera. They were able to reconstruct the thing from its evidence. So that's an example of somebody being able to, so that's a piece of a whole new set of techniques of research that are going on to reconstruct things having to do with the nature of the scrolls. On the other hand, we had quite a bit of the research that went on at was reported at the conference is in areas that have not been researched. I'll give an example. My colleague at NYU, Alex Jason, about violence in the scrolls and how it's understood in scholarship. And you have to know that this is a very important subject because there's a scroll called the Scroll of the War of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness. We also had papers dealing with, for example, magic and demonology. This is a subject that's not talked about too much. And in general, right, a number of new perspectives on what was going on. So just for example, Jody Magnus, the archaeologist who was a leading scholar of the scrolls and specifically the archaeology of Qumran, putting forward the suggestion that they made a bit of fancy bathhouse at Qumran, something which nobody had seen or suggested before. So these are like new ideas and new approaches to things that, yes, there's been previous research, but this is new and more exciting type of research.
Can you expand more on that, the Greek-style bath at Qumran?
Well, the thing is that we generally believe that the Qumran sectarians represented a group that was completely opposed to anything that was Hellenistic or Greek. And so when we have the possibility that archaeological remains may somehow indicate that such a bathhouse may have existed, so it's an amazing thing. Now, you have to know that this is connected up in a certain way with a bigger background problem, which is that when the scrolls, as many people know, until the early 90s, some of them, much of the material, was not available to the public because of the arrangements made already in Jordan after the scrolls that were being found in Jordan in the 1950s. They had made arrangements with these scholars who had rights to publish that didn't allow the material to be shown to anyone else until they had actually published it, and they had failed to publish it. And there was a whole big stink about that in the early 90s, and the Antiquities Authority of Israel finally stepped in, appointed a new editor, Emmanuel Tov. I had the honor of being one of the 60 or so people that worked to publish all the rest of the scrolls and get them out. But when that happened, the full data from the excavations was not made available. Now that data has begun to be available in a tremendous extent more now through the work of a number of people. And these people, Dennis Mitzi, for example, and has done tremendous work in this area. He's from the University of Malta, and he's working on a 3-volume study now of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And Jody Magnus here, who's one of the leading archaeologists, maybe the leading archaeologist pertaining to the Qumran scrolls, entered into this attempt to look at some runes that had been understood elsewhere in a different way and try and propose the possibility that as part of the building of a complex that had been excavated at Qumran, that a part of it may have been a kind of Roman bath that would have indicated that the people there were not totally, let's say, unaffected by the process of Hellenistic culture and may have made use of such a bath. So it's not so much the details of the bath, but rather the question of whether or not we do or do not have evidence for Hellenistic ideas. And that is a matter still now. We'll have to see what scholars feel with her work out on this topic. I'm sure there are going to be other scholars who have very different interpretations of the very same archaeological evidence. So we'll have a chance to see. That's what we do, right? That's the way in which the so-called peer review works. People argue with one another and will prove or disprove her theory.
Would the bath scenario suggest, among maybe other suggestions that have been made in the past, that not everybody at Qumran was perfectly Torah observant and Torah orthodox?
Well, I would doubt it. I'll tell you why. It seems to me it's a very closed society. There aren't a lot at least the texts talk about people being under control. Why would anybody want to live there who wasn't part of the group? Who in his right mind would move out there? So I can't believe that anybody was there who wasn't really a member of the sect. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean there was never a guest and somebody passed through or whatever else. But I can't believe that you would go to this place if you weren't joining. It's sort of like, you go to a monastery and you start to ask, are the people in this monastery really monks? Well, who's going to live in a monastery? Well, it's not 100%. John Strugnell, who was the Dead Sea Scrolls editor-in-chief for a while, right? He would spend a lot of his time in Jerusalem at the École Biblique, living in a monk's residence. And he wasn't a monk, wasn't even a priest. So, yeah, you could have some exceptions, but I think the majority of it, the vast majority of these people are really members of the group, and they're seeking to live the pious life as the group understands it.
Can you expand more on your work and involvement in trying to get the Dead Sea Scrolls out there?
Well, there are two aspects to this. The one aspect is, let's say, the more technical question of publication, because in the early 1990s, there was this big campaign that this material should be let out and everybody should be able to see it. So that required not just photographs, which most people can't read, but transcriptions and translations. So I had the honor of being invited to join the team that finished that job within maybe about, I would say about 10 years or 15 years after that. And I published a group of texts that were called mysteries texts, and plus some other very small fragments that had to do with law or biblical interpretation. And that was a process of detailed scholarly work. And then also I now, together with Andrew Gross, published we published a new edition of the Temple Scroll, and it's burying manuscripts. But that has been all out there. Now, in differences, because you see, in 1990, 91, there was still a fight going on about making it all public. But when Andrew and I went to work on the Temple Scroll and to re-edit it, by that time everything was public. There was no question about secret text, just a question of doing a better job than people had done before, which we hope we have. So that's got to do with that process of getting out text. Right now, I'm working on a fragment that's not published to see if we still are some unpublished fragments because they get found here or there, right? And in fact, some fragments that came out of the excavation of the cave of Cave 11 came out recently, were published recently. So there still are little pieces here or there. By the way, we need to remember that everything that came to light after 2002, which is new, is forged. So if you get any stuff, you've got to question if it's forged. However, there's another thing you said to me about getting the scrolls out there. So I put a lot of time into getting people to be interested in the scrolls, into getting television programs about them, getting things like this. Why am I here now? I want to get the word out about the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I do that a lot, either both by public appearances and stuff like that, by sometimes letters to the editor or articles that I'm writing. I've got different things that I write, which are more for the general public than for the scholarly public. And that's to get back to this volume that we're talking about that's coming out now. The fact is that it's also an attempt to get out to a wider group of people what Dead Sea Scroll scholarship is.
Can you tell us more about the forged Dead Sea Scrolls? How many of them are out there?
Well, there are 70 or so fragments. Now, everybody knows now what they are, so there's no secret here. They're listed, and you can get photographs of most of them. And I say we know what they are, but they came about through apparently criminal activity. Probably about $20 million was made on their sale to various groups, which, for the most part, most of the buyers were groups of Christian institutions or institutions that wanted to be able to say they had the real Dead Sea Scrolls. And in fact, what they got was forged Dead Sea Scrolls. So it's an interesting problem as to how the forgeries were discovered. They was discovered over a period by one person, then by a number of labs. And it is really clear that these items that we're talking about were forged. And but about 70, and as I say, there's a specific list of them. Nobody can get confused. Okay.
And how does one go about telling, differentiating between a genuine, authentic Dead Sea Scroll and one that's forged?
The inauthentic scrolls carbon date to Antiquity. That is, these little fragments that are inauthentic, they're written on old parchment or leather. And that's a big deal because the real scrolls are written on parchment. And apparently the experts say that these are written on leather. And parchment, in order to make it a writing material, uses chemicals to reorient the fibers of the leather. So don't get the idea that I really know too much about this. I don't, but I'm telling you what I know. Whereas leather is not that way. So it's generally believed that these fragments were forged on leather rather than on actual parchment. The other thing is that one can tell when you investigate them. There's a strange fact. When there's a crack in the leather, an ancient crack in the leather is white because the black is on both sides of the crack. Not these. These cracks were written. These texts were written over the cracked leather. Hence, the black runs right into the furrow of the crack and right out. And then on the sides of these texts, you can tell that the letters were formed to fit on the fragmentary broken pieces. So it looks pretty clear that these are forged texts.
And in my closing question, what do you hope people will take away from reading this new book?
I hope they'll take away the idea that scholarship involves the detailed investigation, of sometimes very small details that add up to big pictures. That the scholars who are working on this material, the scrolls material, are doing new research and understanding things in a way which is much better and more thorough than we understood them before. That this research is an ongoing project, and that it's not a question of, I heard this and I heard that, it must be true, but rather it's a question of taking the time, as we do the research, to figure out what things mean, to make that available to the public, and that's what this volume tries to represent, I think. To people should need to understand what really is what scholars are doing, and how detailed and complicated it is, and yet how in the end it's all really helping us to have a wider picture of this period, which is so important for the development of Judaism and Christianity.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Larry Schiffman.
Thank you for having me.
And I wanted to let everybody know to go check out the History Valley Amazon affiliate link in the description below to go get the new book. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.